Hey, welcome back. It is Tim for Wrong Sports, and this is going to be episode 3, all about the service football teams that played for college football during the World War II years. And I'm going to be turning the calendar now to 1944 and the 1944 college football season, which was very different from 1943 because the war took more of a turn towards victory for the Allied powers this year, and America was mostly focusing on the Pacific and the Japanese, so less men were needed for the war effort this year as in previous years. When September 1944 came around, there were only 11 months left of World War II and only 9 months left before the war in Europe was over. Because more attention was given to the Pacific Fleet, more naval schools as well as Air Force programs were given more men, and it showed this year on the college football field. 1944 was also the last year for a full season for most of these service teams, so I'll be combining 1944 with 1945 as there weren't really any teams left when September 1945 came around. So the first team I'm going to be covering this year is March Field. Now, I mentioned them and their beginnings in my 1943 video, but they were still an extremely powerful and strong team going into 1944. I'm mentioning them mostly because of their unusual schedule. Now, I mentioned how in 1944 there were many college football teams that came back, but the Pacific Coast Conference was still a year away from all of their members returning. And since March Field played many of their teams from the PCC, they had to find some replacements. And their replacements were a couple of professional football teams and even more service teams. So they started their year against a pro team playing the Washington Redskins in the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. If you don't know what that is, it's one of the biggest stadiums in the country. And that game was held in front of 55,000 people. It was an exhibition/fundraiser for the war. This really didn't count onto their record, but they still had to play the game. The game was played on August 25th, which was a full month before the football schedules actually began, and about 6 weeks before the NFL season kicked off. Now, the game was really close because Washington lost a lot of their players to the war, and March Field still had a lot of their really good players from last year, and they still had their really good running back, Jack Jacobs, as well as several other players, but Washington still won the game 7-3. After they played another exhibition of sorts against the San Diego Bombers of the Pacific Coast Football League, which was a top-level football league, mostly in California, though there were also some teams in Washington as well as Hawaii. March Field went to San Diego to play the Bombers and destroyed them 56-7, and what was another fundraiser for the war, as it was also a fundraiser for the Bombers. After these professional games, though, they played a few service teams like the Alameda Coast Guard, St. Mary's Preflight, and so much more. They tied Alameda, but they won all their other games to be 4-1-1 when they played their 2 PCC games on their schedule. Their first one was against UCLA, and then they played Washington, who were both in rebuilding years, so March Field easily defeated both of them to be 7-1-1 going into their final 2 games. So first, they traveled to Denver to play the 2nd Air Force, who, like them, played a bunch of games, mostly against service teams this year, but they also played University of Washington as well as Iowa Preflight and came into this game being 10-2. The game was played in late November in Denver, so scoring was very limited to nothing, and they tied the game 0-0. March Field ended their season against the best service team this year, and the team that I'll be telling you a little bit more about in just about a minute, and their name was Randolph Field. But let me get back to March Field, though, because they didn't return to a full college football schedule in 1945, and they actually ended their 3 seasons as a service team with a record of 21-5-2, being coached by Paul Schischler all 3 years, and Schischler would end his coaching career with March Field this year, and he would eventually go on to partially own a team in the Pacific Coast Football League, which I mentioned before. And one last final note about March Field and their best player, Jack Jacobs. His actual nickname was Indian Jack Jacobs. He was given that nickname because he was part of the Creek tribe, and Jack Jacobs would actually have a great football career after the war. Before the war, he was actually on the Cleveland Rams, but after the war, he would be on the Washington Redskins for a year. Then he went to the Packers from 47 to 49 before he made a name for himself in Canada with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, where he would be a Canadian Football All-Star from 1950 to 52, as well as be in the Canadian Football Hall of Fame in 1963. But let's move on from March Field and go into the team that was voted the best service team in 1944, and that was Randolph Field. In 1943, Randolph Field was 9-1-1, and they ended up going to the Cotton Bowl where they tied University of Texas, but their schedule wasn't really good in 1943 as they mostly played exclusively service teams. And this year was no different than 1943 in their schedule, but it was different on the field because they were way more dominant on the field in 1944 than they were in 1943. Another thing that also didn't change for Randolph Field was their coaching staff, as Frank Tritico was back coaching the Ramblers again. And their team was very talented this year, with several players having professional experience. One of those players being Bill Dudley, who graduated from Virginia and played in the NFL in 1942, where he led the league in rushing and was also named to the All-Pro team. Along with him, they also had Martin Ruby, who was an All-American tackle before the war for Texas A&M when they went to 2 Cotton Bowls. And to add to their roster, they had starters from Notre Dame, Alabama, Baylor, and Texas. So with this much better roster, Tritico went on a tear with the Ramblers through the 1944 season, which were mostly against service teams, except they did play 3 Texas schools in that they played Texas, SMU, and Rice, but they easily beat them all as they beat Rice 59-0, Texas 42-6, and SMU 41-0. They would be ranked number 4 in the AP poll after this start and would destroy all the other service teams on their schedule to go 10-0, where they only gave up 1 touchdown. That's it in their first 10 games, and they averaged over 40 points a game. So they had 1 more game left on their schedule, but they were the best service team in the country in 1944, and because of that, they were invited to play 1 more additional game called the Treasury Bond Bowl, which I'll get to in just a bit. But before that bowl game, they would have to play March Field. And I mentioned how March Field was one of the better teams this year, and that was why 50,000 people showed up in LA to see the game and also raise money for the Navy. On this day, the Army Air Force team of Randolph Field beat the 4th Air Force School in Marchfield 20-7, making Randolph Field 11-0 and number 3 in the nation as they traveled across the country to the Polo Grounds for their December 16th date in the Treasury Bond Bowl. So along with this additional game, they also only had 6 days from their previous game against March Field to get ready for this game against the 2nd Air Force. Now, the 2nd Air Force was also coming off another short rest as they also played a game on the same day that Randolph Field did. So both of these teams were playing on 6 days rest, except Randolph Field had to travel from LA to New York, while the 2nd Air Force only had to travel from Atlanta to New York. And this game was being played in late fall in New York, so the weather was cold, and just about 8,000 people showed up to see this game. Luckily, though, even with the sparse crowd, it managed to raise $79 million for the war. The game was a close one, but Randolph Field managed to win 13-6 to end their season 12-0. They were also ranked number 3 in the final AP poll, as well as winning the final service team national title. Randolph Field did not have a team in 1945, which was like most teams that came from the Air Force programs. The Air Force would eventually combine all of these service teams to form one team known as the Air Force Falcons that we know of now, and they established that team in 1958. So I just told you about 2 of the best service teams out west, but let's travel east to talk about a service team that was around for most of the World War II years in North Carolina Preflight. They were established on February 1st, 1942 by the Secretary of the Navy and opened up that April on the campus of UNC in Chapel Hill. I mentioned a little bit about them in my 1942 video, but in 1943 they were not very good, hence why I didn't mention them, as they only won 2-4-1 in a shortened schedule. This year, though, they were getting a new coach led by George Killinger, who was a baseball player and football player from Penn State, and he played baseball in minor leagues throughout the late 1910s through 1930s, as well as played football in the mid-1920s for the Canton Bulldogs, as well as the New York Giants. After Killinger played, he eventually coached both sports. The team also had a man known as Bear. Yes, Paul Bear Bryant was an assistant on the team this year, and Bear Bryant was a well-known line coach in the South as he was an assistant at his alma mater, Alabama, as well as Vanderbilt before the war. But when America went to war, he quit his job at Vanderbilt, turned down a head coaching job at Arkansas, and went for the Navy. He was sent to Georgia to help run the athletic department at Georgia Preflight before coming to North Carolina Preflight. So with this good coaching staff, the team also welcomed a new quarterback from Northwestern. His name was Otto Graham. He was very well known, especially in the Midwest, for his great play on bad Northwestern teams, really only achieving one good team in 1943. Graham was ready to win, as well as get ready for his career after the war. Now, North Carolina Preflight started their year with a 2-touchdown win over another service team out of North Carolina. Their name was Cherry Point Marines. They would play their biggest game of the season next, in their second game against Navy. Navy was known to be the best team in the early 1940s, as they routinely beat Army in their rivalry games, and in 1943 the Navy went 8-1, only losing to Notre Dame, but they shut out Army in that rivalry game, as well as shut out North Carolina Preflight that year too. So North Carolina Preflight was coming into this game looking to make it a closer game, and it was close as it was tied 14-14 going into the final quarter. North Carolina Preflight had the ball with a minute or two left before Otto Graham threw a 55-yard touchdown to give them a 21-14 win and make North Carolina Preflight 2-0 going into another tough game against another Southern powerhouse known as Duke. Duke had one of the best teams in the 1930s and 40s, but the war took away a lot of their best players and their legendary coach, Wallace Wade. Wade's replacement was another legend, but on the hardwood, as Eddie Cameron took over for the Blue Devils football team this year. He led the team to an 8-1 record in 1943 and was 1-1 to start in 1944. Preflight took it to them early and squeaked by them with a 13-6 win, and were now ranked number 2 in the AP poll as they traveled to another Southern powerhouse in Virginia. Now, Virginia was a little different from North Carolina Preflight and other schools because they didn't have a V-12 program on their campus during the war, but they did have a minor Air Force based in Richmond, but they were still able to field teams during the war due to having enough college-aged men on campus. They were still pretty good all of these years and were actually 2-1 coming into this game against Preflight. Preflight had a little bit of trouble closing out this game, and they tied 13-13, sending North Carolina Preflight to a number 10 ranking now in the polls. North Carolina Preflight was done with colleges and played all service teams for the rest of the year with a home-and-home game against Georgia Preflight, where they won both of them. They lost to another team from Camp Perry in Virginia, as well as losing to the Bainbridge Naval Training Station out of Maryland, who were actually undefeated this year, to close out their season 6-2-1. North Carolina Preflight was ready to actually field the team in 1945, even though the war in Europe had ended. They still were using the campus for training and had enough men during the summer of 1945 to field a team. The team in 1945 was actually going to be coached by none other than Bear Bryant, who would have had his first head coaching job if this team would have played. But it wasn't meant to be, as in late August 1945, after Japan surrendered, they ended the North Carolina Preflight program, and Bryant would have to wait another year to coach. He would end up going to Maryland in 1946, becoming a coach there, and coaching 14 guys at Maryland who were from this North Carolina Preflight team. So I started out the 1944 video with a bunch of teams I haven't talked about before, but before I close out this year, I'm going to talk about two teams I've talked about a lot already in Iowa Preflight and the Great Lakes Navy. Both of these teams would come into the 1944 year with lots of changes, obviously on the field, but also on their coaching staff. But with all of these changes, both of these teams were still able to have great seasons this year. First, I'm going to start with Iowa Preflight. They were coming off a number 2 ranking in 1943, as well as a share of the service title that year. They started the season with a change at coach, as Farrat was out as he was sent to another school late in the summer. So Jack Meager, he was actually a coach at Auburn from 1934 to 1942, and was actually the reason for Auburn Stadium being built during that time. He was in. On the coaching staff with him was a legend in the making, as Bud Wilkinson was an assistant for Iowa Preflight in 1944. Along with being an assistant football coach during the war, Wilkinson was also a hangar deck officer on the USS Enterprise, which was the most decorated warship during World War II. So there you go with some other random facts. Along with the new coach, they had some familiar faces on the field. I didn't tell you much about this guy in 1943, but he deserves some explanation. This guy was the QB for Iowa Preflight during some of the 1943 season, but he was mostly quarterback for the 1944 season. His name was Arthur Gepp. He was a QB on Marquette during the late 1930s, and then he was an assistant there as well as an assistant coach at Virginia up to 1942 when the war eventually kicked off. Gepp entered the Navy, and he was sent to Iowa. He was 27 when he came to the base, and when he was a starter at the start of the 1944 season, he was 28, which was by far one of the oldest players I've covered, so I felt like I needed to mention him. Gepp would have a bigger career after the war as he coached at Virginia and Vanderbilt, as well as being the commissioner of the Ohio Valley Conference for 12 years in the 1960s and 70s. And another player I didn't cover much in the 1943 season was their star running back Bernard Bus Meritus. He was known in Iowa before the war as he was a student at Iowa University in 1941, and when World War II started, he didn't really move anywhere and instead became a trainee at Iowa Preflight on the same campus. Meritus played all 3 years during the war with Iowa Preflight and was the prime runner in 1944. It's really hard to find stats for this team, but after looking at some box scores that they played, they ran the ball about 10 times more than they threw, so he had quite the rushing load this year. With their new coaching staff and some of their players back from last year, they started their year with 2 games against the Big Ten. I mentioned before how this year was different from 1943 because a lot of teams that shut down their program in 1943 were back in 1944, but even though some of these schools came back, that didn't mean that the players came back with it. That was what happened with Iowa Preflight's first team, Michigan. They won their conference in 1943, but they nearly lost their entire team as only 8 players from last year returned. Michigan made up for it with 32 players from their V12 program, which still made them a really great team this year. Iowa Preflight had to go to Ann Arbor for this first game against Michigan, and it was a tough first half with Michigan taking a 6-0 lead into halftime. Iowa Preflight would eventually take the lead in the third with a touchdown of their own, but would eventually fall at the end of the game 12-7, giving them their first loss since their Notre Dame loss in November of 1943. Iowa Preflight didn't run the ball well in this game as they only had 99 yards, but that would kickstart their attack in their next game. They would play another Big Ten team in the next game, traveling to Minnesota. This game was close for most of it, but Iowa Preflight was able to pull out the 19-13 win and gave them their first win of the season. The wins would continue as they played a Navy base out of Iowa City next, and the 2nd Air Force after that. I mentioned earlier how the 2nd Air Force was a hell of a team this year, and that game was a slugfest, but Iowa Preflight was able to squeak out a 12-6 win and getting them ranked number 11 going into their 5th game against the number 4 ranked Purdue Boilermakers. Purdue wasn't the same team as their undefeated 1943 team was. They were still a V12 program, but they didn't reap the benefits of better players like Michigan did, and it showed as they could beat college programs, but they had trouble with service teams. Purdue, even with their talent being diminished, played tough, but Iowa Preflight was able to pull out another close 12-6 win. Iowa Preflight's schedule was much easier as they shut out Fort Warren, which was a base out of Massachusetts, and Marquette before beating Tulsa and Missouri on the road. This made Iowa Preflight 9-1 going into their final game at home against the other home team, the Iowa Hawkeyes. Now, I also forgot to mention the really cool name that Iowa Preflight had for their team. They were called the Seahawks, which I guess was piggybacking on the Iowa Hawkeyes. And speaking of Iowa, they were not very good during the war years, as they never got talent from their base on campus, and their famous coach Eddie Anderson left in 1942. He would eventually return in a few years, but it didn't really help them. Iowa was terrible in 1944, almost as bad as they were in 1943, but this year they were 1-6 with their only win against another bad team, Nebraska, and Iowa was averaging less than 7 points a game. They also got shut out 3 times this year as well. And the game was played on a cold day just after Thanksgiving, so it started slow for both teams. But eventually Iowa Preflight and the Seahawks would score 4 times along with a field goal to take the game 30-6 and end their season 10-1 along with a number 6 ranking in the AP poll. And the Iowa Preflight Seahawks, like the other service schools I mentioned, didn't play next season, but Iowa Preflight had some of the best seasons of any service teams, as they won 26-5 during the 1942 to 1944 seasons and finished ranked in the top 10 both seasons, along with grabbing that service title in 1943. The Iowa Hawkeyes would eventually get better after 1946, and there was even a little connection between Iowa Preflight and Iowa, as in 1952 they would hire Forrest Evashevsky, who actually played with Preflight for most of the 1942 season. Finally, I want to cover my favorite team again, because they were one of the few teams to play in 1944 and also again in 1945, and that was the Great Lakes Navy Blue Jackets. Great Lakes came into the 1944 season with a new coach as Paul Brown. The famous Ohio State coach was at the helm. Along with Brown, they also had a brand new team, as most of their starters from the 1943 team left for war or for another base, so Brown was working with a blank slate. The Blue Jackets had new starters at quarterback, as former Iowa starter Jim Ewell was starting now. And along with that, he had a new running back, who was like last year's runner, as he was from Notre Dame, in Jim Mello. Finally, they had some future coaching royalty on their team, as playing as a back for them this season was none other than the future Notre Dame coach, Ara Parseghian. With the coaching staff and the revamped roster, the Blue Jackets kicked off their season with a service team outside of Chicago, Fort Sheridan, who they easily beat 62-0. Then they went on their yearly Big Ten/Midwestern teams run. Luckily, they got to play some of them at home, as they got Purdue and Illinois at Ross Field and beat them by the same unusual score of 27-18. This left them 3-0 as they traveled a little north of their base to Northwestern. Northwestern was one of their biggest rivals during the war years, but like I mentioned before, Otto Graham, who was the starter in 1943, was not the starter this year, and Purdue lost most, if not all, of their stars from the season previous, so Great Lakes made quick work of them, shutting them out 25-0. Great Lakes would come back home to shut out Western Michigan after that and make them number 4 in the AP polls, going into a top 10 matchup with also undefeated Ohio State. This game was going to be tricky for Great Lakes, not just because they were playing an undefeated top 5 team, but because it was Paul Brown's old school. Over 75,000 people showed up in Ohio Stadium for the game, and they welcomed Brown with open arms. But once the game started, Brown was looking for the win. Unfortunately for Brown, they were playing against someone he recruited, and someone who wasn't a huge fan of his, Les Horvath. Now, Horvath wasn't a big fan of Brown because he came to Ohio State in 1940 and played for the Buckeyes in 1940, 41, and 42, but wasn't a starter even on their 1942 national title team. After the 1942 season, Horvath went into dentistry school and didn't think he would ever play again, but new Ohio State coach Carol Widows, who was also an assistant on the 1942 team, came to him with an offer to play again, but with more playing time than he had before. Widows was allowed to play Horvath even though he was a graduate and in graduate school in the time, and he was also 23, because of a wartime rule where if you didn't exhaust all 4 years of your playing eligibility, then you were still able to play. It's kind of like now with the redshirt rule. So Horvath still had 1 year left and was a much-needed addition to the Buckeyes team this year, which was full of freshmen and a lot of underclassmen. The game was a low-scoring game most of the way, and the Blue Jackets were even able to stop Horvath from scoring. The game was tied 6-6 going into the fourth quarter, before the Buckeyes broke loose, especially Horvath, who scored twice in the fourth quarter to give Ohio State the 26-6 win. Brown would say before the game that he didn't even scout Ohio State or make a game plan because he was still very loyal to Ohio State, as he told the administration he would come back to coach for them after the war, but we'll go more into that later. Great Lakes now were sitting at 5-1. They were still ranked as they were number 16, but they traveled next week to play another Big Ten team in Wisconsin. Wisconsin was going through the same thing as Purdue, as in 1944, they lost much of their roster and talent and were not the same team that beat Great Lakes in 1942. Also, Paul Brown was looking for some retribution for the 1942 Ohio State team that lost to Wisconsin due to Brown's team drinking some bad drinking water when he was in Madison, Wisconsin before the game. Great Lakes would start strong and end strong as they scored the first 34 points to eventually win 40-6. Great Lakes stayed on the road for their next game against Marquette, where they took a 32-7 lead in the halftime to eventually close them out 45-7. Great Lakes would play Marquette again, this time at home 2 weeks later, and they won again. Great Lakes stayed at home to play 2 more service teams, easily beating Fort Warren out of Wyoming, and then playing the 3rd Air Force. The 3rd Air Force, like Great Lakes, were able to get the best players, mostly from Southern schools, as they were located in North Carolina. The game didn't start well for Great Lakes as they were down 10-0 going into the 4th quarter, and Brown didn't want to lose this game to a service team, which is something that Great Lakes never did, actually. But the Blue Jackets were able to score twice, with the winning touchdown happening with 59 seconds remaining, allowing Great Lakes to win 12-10 and be 9-1 going to their final game against who else? Notre Dame. Notre Dame was a drastically different team from 1943. First off, they didn't have Frank Leahy anymore, as he was enlisted, and also didn't have any of their Heisman winners, as Bertelli and Lujack were sent to war. Lujack would eventually return after the war to play, and Creighton Miller graduated, and their second best runner, Jim Mello, was actually playing on Great Lakes. So Notre Dame would promote several underclassmen to start this year, as well as promote several assistant coaches. Edward McKeever was actually the one who was promoted to coach, though, this year. Notre Dame didn't have much trouble navigating through their non-service team schedule, but they did play Navy and Army this year in back-to-back games. Army had the best team during this time, and Navy, even though they lost twice this year, were still very strong. Notre Dame was ranked number 2 going into the first game against Navy, but they lost 32-13, and then the next week they had to travel all the way to Yankee Stadium to play Army, and that went even worse as Army ran all over them and beat them 59-0, securing their number 1 ranking after that, and they would eventually win the national title as well. Notre Dame, even though they lost twice, they were still ranked number 9 going into their final game against Great Lakes, and this year's game was played at Notre Dame Stadium, and Great Lakes wanted to make it 2 in a row versus the Irish. They were tied 7-7 going into the half, but that would be it for Great Lakes as Notre Dame scored 3 straight times, all in the second half, and won 28-7. This ended the Blue Jackets season at 9-2, and because of their 2 losses and Randolph Field being undefeated, Randolph Field won the service title that made its home during the war years at Great Lakes. So now the 1944 season was over, and so were a lot of service teams, as well as Paul Brown, head coach of Ohio State, which I'll put in quotations. Brown told Ohio State officials after the 1943 season that he would come back to Columbus to continue coaching the football team, which I mentioned before. But in the winter of 1944, an offer would come his way that he couldn't turn down. It was a huge offer to be the highest paid coach in football at the time, as well as part ownership in a new team in the new league, the All-American Football League. But Brown thought about it for a few months before accepting the deal in February of 1945. Ohio State was fairly annoyed with him not coming back, but Brown had his sights on creating a new team in his own image, and he used the 1945 Blue Jackets season to find new players for his new Browns team. The 1945 Great Lakes season was unlike any other. As previously said, Great Lakes were the only service team that would play a full college season this year. Also, it was a weird season because by the time the 1945 college season kicked off, America and the Allies had won World War II. A lot of men that were going to college during the war years, but instead enlisted, were now coming back to the States. Some schools did benefit from the men returning from war, but the real benefit didn't come until 1946. The Blue Jackets this season had new faces as well. One of those was a running back who played at Nevada because he wasn't highly recruited due to him being black. That player was Marion Motley. Motley came to Great Lakes after dropping out of Nevada in 1943 due to a football injury, and he eventually joined the Navy at 24 in 1944 and was sent to Great Lakes. He didn't play much on offense in 1944, but he was a starter on offense and defense in 1945. So most of the Blue Jackets' 1944 team was either discharged during this time or were overseas, so whoever was still on the base during this time tried out for the team and probably made it. They were still able to get some really good talent this year, but they had less players with NFL experience in 1945 and more players coming right out of high school playing on this team. They were still able to get some college stars, as Frank Aschenbrenner, who was a running back on Marquette before the war and bounced around several naval bases before his arrival at Great Lakes, was now the starter at running back. With both him and Motley, the Blue Jackets had a great running attack. This went well with their new QB from none other than Notre Dame, George Turlip. Turlip never started at Notre Dame as a quarterback, as he was mostly a backup to their star quarterback Angelo Bertelli, but Turlip did mostly start at Notre Dame at center. So Turlip was given the reins at Great Lakes, and it took him some time to get used to being the starter. And it actually took most of the team some time to get to playing as a team also. Because of this, their first few games were very rough. They started off playing against the College All-Stars in an exhibition/fundraiser at Ross Field. The Blue Jackets couldn't match the power of the All-Stars and lost at home 35-0. They continued with their yearly partial Big Ten schedule as they would play Michigan next, losing, but at least they scored in this game. They lost 27-2. They would stay at home to play Wisconsin to a 0-0 tie before losing to the rebuilding Purdue 20-6. Great Lakes were now 0-3-1, but their team was starting to play better. They would then play another service team from Georgia. Their name was Fort Benning. Benning was too tough for them, but it was still closer than their previous games, but Great Lakes was still not able to win as they lost to Fort Benning 21-12. So now Great Lakes were 0-4-1. Most observers of the team were assuming that Brown wasn't too worried since he had his next team and his next job already lined up in Cleveland. Plus, most of the players and most of the people thought that Brown was using this team and this season to find starters for his Browns in 1946, which would eventually be correct. But Brown fought those naysayers, and he stuck with Great Lakes as they trudged on through the rest of the 45 season. They played familiar foe in Marquette next and finally got on the winning side. They followed that up with 4 more wins over Western Michigan, Michigan State, Illinois, and Fort Warren, their final service team. Great Lakes were now 5-4-1 as they went back home to play their final game against Notre Dame. Before we get to that game, there are a few things I want to go over. First, Notre Dame weren't in the running for the national title in 1945, but they were still regarded as a top 5 team, as their only loss was to what some regarded as the best team ever, the 1945 Army team. They did tie Navy, who was considered the second best team that year, so Notre Dame was 7-1-1, and they had a very outside shot at a share of the national title, as they needed Navy to beat Army on this day. Next, Great Lakes were going through tons of changes that year as many of their men left the base or were discharged, like I mentioned earlier, including some of the men that were still playing on the team. One of those was Marion Motley. He was actually discharged a week or two before Thanksgiving in 1945, meaning that he didn't have to play against Notre Dame, which was scheduled for December 1st, just about 3 weeks after his discharge. Motley agreed to play, though. So along with the discharge, there were also lots of injuries on the team. Motley was actually going to be playing this final game with a shoulder injury he suffered the week before, and Motley wasn't the only one playing hurt, as their quarterback, Aschenbrenner, had a sprained ankle, and there were about a dozen or so other injuries on the team that were actually made public because the Chicago Tribune posted it in their newspaper a couple of days before the game. This would be the final game for Brown, too, as he was all packed and ready to go as his discharge would be finalized towards the end of 1945. So with all of these things working against Great Lakes, they still came into the game with Notre Dame to close out their season with a win. The game was close for most of it as Great Lakes had a 13-7 lead going into halftime, and after halftime, Great Lakes didn't stop pushing Notre Dame as they went on an 80-yard, 18-play drive to take a 19-7 lead when they went into the fourth quarter. Notre Dame had trouble all throughout the second half and actually changed their quarterback in the second half, but it still didn't do anything for them as they were shut out in the second half. It was the opposite for Great Lakes, though, as they scored 4 touchdowns in the fourth quarter, with one being a 44-yard touchdown by Motley. The 4 touchdowns in the fourth quarter was a first for Notre Dame and their defense, too. Media members in attendance were shocked at the final score of Great Lakes 39, Notre Dame 7. Army ended up cruising by Navy that same afternoon, so Notre Dame's outside shot at another title was mute, but this big loss was more crushing to them. And there's a reason why I love to cover and love to learn more about Great Lakes, because during the 4 years of wartime football, they went 33-10-3, and they had a 2-1-1 record over Notre Dame, as well as 2 service national titles. Paul Brown would eventually leave the base in January 1946 and brought with him Motley to the Browns, where him and Motley won several pro titles. Plus, Motley was also the rushing leader in the NFL for the 1950 season. Great Lakes was the main reason for these videos, and I hope you enjoyed them all. Plus, if you want to learn more about service teams, there is a great book which I used most of my Great Lakes Navy information from, and that book is called By Air, Ground, and Sea, The History of Great Lakes Navy Football. It might be tough to find, as I've only found a few copies left on Amazon, but if you can find it, it is such a great read, and it'll give you a lot more info about Great Lakes and about all the other service teams during this time. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with me, and make sure you give me a like. Make sure you share this video. Also, subscribe to my channel. Also, find me on Twitter at Wronged Sports. You can also search Sports Wronged. I come up as either or, and give me a follow there. And again, thank you so much for hanging out with me and also learning more about service football during World War II.